Good afternoon, everyone. Apologies, I realized my microphone was muted, but thank you all so much for your patience. I really appreciate it. Um, it looks like we do have a critical mass who's been able to join us this afternoon. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, but I will be letting some folks in. If they arrive a couple of minutes late, I know that noon is an easy time for some and a hard time for others. So I appreciate you all for taking the time to join us today for this learning session. For those of you I have met before, thank you so much for joining. Great to see you again. For those of you I have not met, my name is Blair Daniel, and I'm a specialist at DC PCSB. I work specifically in our school performance department on our accountability team. And one of my major work streams is thinking about attendance. Um, as many of you may know, DCPCSB has been looking at revising the existing attendance policy for quite some time this year. My hope today is to walk you through a bit of our learnings and help you get a sense for the direction that we're going in. Um, so first off, just to give you an indication of how we will be spending the next hour or so. First, I would like to walk through what is really occurring with attendance, what is the problem related to attendance, then take a look at what state laws exist in DC, then specifically dive into where DCPCSB's previous attendance policy was, where the proposed attendance policy is going, and then hopefully I can get some feedback from all of you via our survey towards the end of our session today. So first off, I would like to discuss the problem. Before we get into this, I'm sure that these terms are familiar. I just want to make sure that we're speaking with the same terms throughout today. So just as a reminder, in-seat attendance is the percentage of instructional days where a student is present. That's either partial or full. Chronic absenteeism is when that student misses 10% or more of the available instructional days that they're enrolled in. So this includes both excused and unexcused absences, and includes both full and partial days. The difference that I like to think about is that chronic absenteeism really looks at the total loss in learning time as opposed to learning time related to a specific kind of absence. Whereas truancy is when a student is absent from school without a recognized excuse. Once a student has collected 10 or more unexcused absences, that's when they're considered chronically truant. And this measure really looks at compliance with school rules or state laws as they are applicable. So why think about attendance? As I started to dive into this topic, some research really jumped out at me. First, that poor attendance in early grades can be associated with students being behind in both reading and math skills. Later on in secondary, students with poor attendance trends um, have a correlation with either lack of course completion or a impact on graduation rates. This particularly shows up for students who are already experiencing equity challenges, and specifically for students who are experiencing unstable housing or students who are experiencing unstable transportation or means to get to school. And as I'm sure folks in this room are aware, we saw a national spike in chronic absenteeism across the US following the COVID-19 pandemic. And in many, many states and jurisdictions, those rates still remain above pre-pandemic levels, even as a lot of other aspects of our schools have recovered. Um, and then I wanted to share this slide. It's from Attendance Works, which if you are not familiar, they're a national advocacy and research organization specifically focused on student attendance. And I've, used a lot of their research and recommendations to inform my thinking. They share this slide where root causes are grouped into four key buckets. But I wanted to present this slide because it really informed my thinking about that, how there's such a wide variety and so many variable root causes that are contributing to student attendance and chronic absenteeism. That finding one solution that could meet all of these root causes just doesn't seem realistic. It is a complicated issue. There are a lot of inputs, and that needs to inform how we think about policies and practices. I'll leave this on for just a few more moments for folks to have the chance to skim over any additional points before moving on to the next slide. All right. And then specifically, I want to turn to what this looks like in DC. So, as probably many folks in this room are aware, OSSI has reported that 39.5% of students were chronically absent in school year 24-25. That's compared to 30.2% in school year 2018-19, showing that our chronic absenteeism rate as a city is still much higher than pre-pandemic levels. Additionally, the DC Policy Center shared a report that showed that 56% of high school students are chronically absent or were chronically absent in school year 23-24. And of those students, only 3% of the students with significant amounts of absenteeism from school, really struggling with attendance, were meeting those SAT college readiness benchmarks compared to 35% of their peers with satisfactory attendance, showing that achievement gap. And then finally, I'm sure that many folks in this room also were able to see the Washington Post's series that they published last summer. But one of the key connections there was this conversation between school leaders and or between city leaders, and how coordination between government agencies has been an issue, which also echoes what I have heard from many of the school leaders and school staff that I have engaged with over the course of thinking about this issue. So next, before moving on, I do want to take a quick look at DC attendance laws and requirements. Um, so as you're aware, in DC, the at a state level, so for everyone here, compulsory attendance is set forth by DC Code 38-2.2, and that's including any student who is age 5 by September 30th through turning 18 or graduating, they are required to be in school. Presence is defined as 60% or more of the day, and all our campuses have daily reporting to OSSI. And then I just wanted to share this process, which again, school-based folks are very familiar with, but following the daily monitoring and submission of data to OSSI, if a student reaches 5 unexcused absences, that's when a school-based staff will hold a mandatory student support team meeting, really focusing on interventions that can happen for that student. But should a student reach 10 or more unexcused absences, depending on their age, that is when a referral will be made to a different government agency, that being Child and Family Services or OAG, again, depending on the student's age. Now, I would like to look at the previous DC PCSB attendance policy. I'm going to guess that for folks today, there's a mixed understanding, so I do want to start with the basics. It may sound familiar, but just to make sure that everyone has the same information walking into our conversation. So the old policy process really moved from um, a flat threshold that was set based on kinds of schools. So first, a campus would be notified if that campus had exceeded a truancy threshold and asked to review their data before the next DC-PCSB board meeting. That data review would usually take 2 weeks, and changes to the data in a school system would be transferred to OSSI and then transferred to us via our connection with OSSI. And during this time, our understanding is that many schools would be combing through their attendance and records and also finding instances where perhaps documentation was provided for a excused absence but had not been entered into the system. So rectifying any of those data discrepancies. Then a campus would come before DCPCSB's board if they remained above that truancy threshold following that data review. Um, that was the opportunity for the school to share with DCPCSB a bit more about what is going on, and the DCPCSB board would issue a notice of concern. And then finally, campuses would need to meet 2 of 3 conditions in order to lift a notice of concern. Those conditions included maintaining in-seat attendance for non-truant students above that threshold, improving in-seat attendance for truant students, and maintaining a campus-wide truancy rate below the threshold for students who were not considered truant. Um, so when I started working on this policy, we heard quite a few criticisms, pain points, confusions with how this policy had worked, those specifically related to the timing of a policy when schools were engaging both with PCSB staff as well as the board, and tracking concerns, considering that these 3 require having a new data system. The other thing I would like to highlight from here is in the old system, in practice, many notices of concern were lifted in June to allow schools to have a fresh start. Um, Given the feedback that we heard, um, we started thinking about how a attendance policy could be redesigned to address these pain points, consider our current context, and really focus on um, providing the space for understanding those variable root causes and how schools need to respond to a complex issue. We wanted this policy to be proactive, ensuring that campuses have earlier interactions with PCSB staff, as well as more information. We wanted to make sure that any policy was data informed and could be designed to adjust based on the current context. We wanted to ensure that a new policy was predictable so campuses could anticipate what conditions would be and how they were going to interact with PCSB, and then clear and regularly communicated, making sure that schools could access not only the policy, but business rules as well as general practices, so that it would be very clear what PCSB would be looking for, asking for, what next steps any school could expect. Um, what I think it is essential to uplift is especially considering um, the landscape of laws in DC, what falls into the scope of this policy and what does not fall into the scope of this policy. So this policy does identify what DCPCSB considers concerning trends related to student attendance and directs how DCPCSB will engage with campuses based on those concerns. What this policy will not is not in the scope of this policy is changes that changing what is required by DC law related to attendance tracking or truancy referrals, or affecting what action other DC government agencies would take related to either that tracking or those truancy referrals. So now the meat and potatoes of our presentation. Um, so based on what we have heard, what our guiding principles are, this is what we have worked with several working group members to develop as a direction for a new policy. Um, so first, I'll share an overview of what this policy process would look like. Then I'll dive into specific components to offer some more detail. And then I'll tell you a little bit more about what the engagement process has looked like thus far, and what you could expect for engagement moving forward. So with this new process, we wanted to ensure that any new policy was, again, proactive. So thinking before an audit, um, ensuring that DC has the opportunity to regularly communicate with school staff. Um, so sending out messages that include attendance metrics, particularly ensuring that they include year-over-year changes for campuses and comparisons to a campus's framework. So school staff and attendance teams are able to understand, are there changes in what's happening with their attendance and how their attendance may look similar or different from high schools, other PK8 schools, etc. Then we wanted to think about what are the warning lights, what would indicate that there's something different, something concerning that's happening related to attendance at any given campus. Um, so for this, for initiating an audit, um, what we've put forward is instances where chronic absenteeism meets one of three criteria. Looking outside of a norm for that school, performing worse than the previous school year, or above an absolute threshold of attendance. And I will dive into what those mean in just a little bit. Then a audit would be conducted. So if one condition is met, DCPCSB would reach out to the campus, let them know that a condition was met, make sure that they understand what is in the attendance policy, make sure that they understand what an audit process would look like, but no immediate action would be needed from the school. If multiple criteria are met, that is when DCPCSB would conduct a desk audit and an approach questionnaire to understand what are the policies and practices looking like related to attendance? How are attendance teams approaching what they're seeing? Are there areas of improvement, recommendation, further connections that could be made for a school? Where the outcome of the audit would be is issuing one of the following circumstances. So the first would be recommendations based on what PCSB hears from a given campus, where are areas they could look, what are resources they might look into, things to consider for addressing a particular attendance issue. That could also look like a staff-to-staff meeting for understanding more about the context. And then for instances where a pattern of multiple years has been established, that is when PCSB would consider a board-to-board meeting or a notice of concern, again, for that year-over-year pattern. And I'll go into each of these in a bit more detail now. So first, the conditions to initiate an audit. Specifically, what we're thinking for flagging year-over-year spikes is looking if a campus performs one standard deviation away for campus-wide chronic absenteeism from campuses in their same Aspire framework. So if we have a group of high schools, a high school performing one standard deviation away from that group might indicate that something different is happening at that high school that might be concerning related to chronic absenteeism. Additionally, flagging trending outliers. So when chronic absenteeism exceeds the floor set forth in Aspire for schools that are subject to Aspire or the 90th percentile of campuses who are outside of Aspire, that's an indication to us that, again, something big is happening here, um, and something different is happening with attendance. And finally, um, flagging concerning trends. So if a school's chronic absenteeism rate increases more than 3% compared to that same time in the previous year, again, this is an indication that something different may be happening and an audit may be warranted. Um, as I mentioned before, thinking about this audit process in two stages. The first stage being when only one of those conditions is met, ensuring that a school team knows what to expect, is already in communication with DCPCSB, and can ask any questions, any clarifying things that they may need, but no immediate action um, between the campus and PCSB is necessary. Followed by then, if more than one criteria is met, a desk audit and an approach questionnaire to really try and get at the root of what students are experiencing this problem most acutely. Has there been a change that school staff, attendance teams have observed? Are there resources, recommendations for tracking, etc., that may be useful for addressing this concern? And then finally, following that audit, if a campus has been flagged in their first year, again, that could look like recommendations from PCSB staff of some areas a campus may consider, or a staff-to-staff meeting if a discussion is really more warranted based on the situation. Um, but then if a campus is flagged multiple years in a row, for the same sorts of trends, then considering having a board-to-board meeting or a notice of concern. Um, again, really focusing those sorts of consequences on a multi-year established pattern of a campus experiencing particular issues related to chronic absenteeism. So to give you an idea of how this policy would fit with other PCSB policies, we're really thinking of this as a early indicator. So any flags from the attendance monitoring policy would be before a campus would receive Aspire results related to chronic absenteeism in their school climate measure and before reviews and renewals, so that action can be taken early and both PCSB and schools are able to be more proactive related to attendance concerns. And then I wanted to share a bit about the engagement that PCSB has been able to do leading up to the policy that you've just seen. So we've engaged many parties over the course of the last 12 months at this point. I've been able to have conversations with other government agencies as well as organizing partners, as well as hosting a working group for multiple LEAs who were particularly affected by the previous attendance policy. And you can see some of those lovely participants over on the side, as well as being able to engage with the research and attend quite a few events related to um, research around attendance put on by research organizations and advocacy groups. Again, you can see those over to the right. And then I did want to provide a period of time for folks during this call to have the opportunity to react and provide your feedback. So I am going to ask that folks take a survey, and I will drop a link to this in the chat, but the QR code also works. My hope is to get some feedback from all of you. So I know that this was a quick overview of what has gone into a proposed policy. Um, so this survey focuses on three quick questions. One, I want to understand from your perspective if you think that this is the correct direction for an attendance policy from PCSB. Then I want to understand what aspects of this policy proposal you support or stand out to you as positives, as well as one thing that you would encourage I consider changing as we move this policy forward. Because I want to be mindful of folks' time, I'm actually going to mute myself for the next 7 minutes and ask that folks take the opportunity to fill out the survey.
I'm sorry, Blair. Quick question. Is it possible for you to go back to the slide with the desk audit and
Yes,
approach questionnaire just so I can take a look again? Thank
of
you.
course. Just a moment. Um, this slide, Courtney?
Yes, thank you so
Okay,
much.
of course. And Courtney, yes, I am definitely open to questions. I just want to make sure it's a pet peeve of mine when a survey happens at the very end of a session and the time to respond to that isn't incorporated into the time provided. So I want to ensure that that time is provided during the session. Oh, so sorry, Sanjay. I see Marina's question in the chat about what would be outside of the norm. So I will move from this slide to the previous slide. So for the purposes of that indicator, we're thinking of one standard deviation away from the spread of campuses in that specific Aspire framework. So for high schools, whatever the spread is in any given year, looking at one standard deviation away from the norm, schools outside of that standard deviation would indicate to us that something different is happening. To ensure that folks have it, I'm just going to move back to the survey slide, but I will stay quiet for just a couple more moments. Thank you to the 6 folks who have already submitted your survey. I really appreciate you taking the time to offer some feedback. Yes, Marina. I will share more details about that towards the end of the session. But yes,
Excuse me, can you go back to the slide where it shows the steps to the for the audit?
the steps for the audit.
Yes.
Yes, give me just a moment. Is this the slide that you're thinking of?
I believe it was the steps that had like multiple
Um, it Correct me if I'm wrong. Could it possibly be the details of what would come after an audit? All right. Thank you again to folks who have taken the time to submit that survey. Um, in the interest of time, for the last 20 or so minutes, I would like to open the floor for clarifying questions, additional things that you would like to raise in this space. And then I will close us out by sharing a bit more about the timeline of what to expect from here and my contact information. Go ahead, Courtney.
Again, this is not Courtney, this is
Oh, so
Sanjay.
sorry, Sanjay. My
You're fine.
apologies.
You're fine. I should probably change the name, but I don't know how to do all of that yet.
No worries.
I wanted to get some clarity, Blair, and thank you for sharing this, and thank you to the team for doing the work to look at this particular policy. I wanted to know, so this is now being named an attendance policy, not a truancy policy. But I see a lot of conflation in the slides around notice of concerns and measurements of truancy, and then also notices for chronic absenteeism. I want to understand what is the focus of this policy, and how does that focus align with Aspire,
Mhm.
especially for the schools that already have chronic absenteeism as a measure inside of Aspire? And let's start there. Like, right, like what is some clarity around what's the focus of this beyond just attendance? Because attendance is a major focus, yes.
Mhm.
But again, there's this conflation between truancy and chronic absenteeism, and I'm sure your research and the evidence shows that they're two sides of the same coins, but they're being measured in very different ways. And the impact and the intentionality around curbing both can be two different strategies in two different ways. And so I'm curious around what is the focus and how does it align to Aspire for those who already have this as a measure on our frameworks.
Thank you so much for your question, Sanjay. And I think to answer it, I'll need to break it apart into a couple of different sections. So the first section that I would like to share is our thought process behind the shift from the previous policy that focused on campus-wide truancy as the metric setting the threshold and starting that engagement towards chronic absenteeism being the campus-wide metric that would drive PCSB's engagement with schools. Part of that, as you alluded to, is indeed aligning this policy with Aspire. So ensuring that the same measure in Aspire is the one that this policy would use moving forward. So specifically focusing on chronic absenteeism and also aligning with more of a national push towards focusing on chronic absenteeism as a total understanding of learning loss, or periods of time when a student is not present for learning, as opposed to the specific reasons um, that are either excused and processed or not excused and processed. So that shift from the previous policy focusing on truancy to the current policy, or the proposed current proposal focusing on chronic absenteeism, is to align better with Aspire and with national trends that we're seeing. For the second part of your question, Sanjay, um, I do, I certainly want to be careful about where there is or is not overlap for chronic absenteeism and truancy, given that, both are both can be indications of similar issues, the same issue, or completely different issues. Um, when thinking about what could act as a warning light, could tell us that something is looking different at a given campus, or a trend may be concerning, by using a metric like chronic absenteeism that is more focused on just presence or absence, um, that can indicate to us where a student arriving and being present at school um, is becoming a broader issue. Of course, we want to consider when students who have IEPs related to chronic illness would be separated out in that policy, and that's definitely something that we want to ensure is detailed. But understanding the total impact of students not being present is really the drive for that shift. And
Uh,
I
th-
do see some questions in the chat. So Sanjay, I just want to
yeah,
check
go
and
ahead.
see if that
Yeah.
answered your question or if you have a follow-up.
It
Okay.
did a little bit, and I do have a follow-up. I am I'm concerned and wondering about these notices of concerns that will be levied on schools. Um, if their chronic absenteeism reaches whatever threshold, or are at whatever thresholds that you all are indicating for levying notices of concerns, and then also having that then show up as an area of concern within the Aspire framework as well too. So schools have a possibility of being dinged twice
Mhm.
for the same measure. And so my question then becomes, what is the value of the notices of concern? And if they're showing up already in the Aspire framework for schools that have it on the Aspire, how would we not feel like we're being
Mhm.
penalized twice for the same thing? With a notice of concern, and then B, with a flag of
Mhm.
concern when the Aspire results come out.
Sure. Thank you for that question as well. I when thinking about how this policy could fit into other policies, ensuring that alignment with Aspire and also timing related to Aspire and review and renewals was really essential. So I am going to flip back just to that slide about what a campus could expect following an audit. So in the first year that a school may have met two or more of these conditions and gone through an audit. The only things that would happen that we're considering are recommendations for the school to consider. So, sourcing best practices, maybe connecting with a peer school that has dealt with a similar issue. If a school is struggling with contacting a DC government agency, being able to do some advocacy there, but really focused on solutions-oriented recommendations, or perhaps a staff-to-staff meeting. Again, if the content of that is going to be easier to have in a conversation. Then for the notice of concern, limiting that to a campus that has experienced the same chronic absenteeism issue. So gone through the audit process 2 years in a row. From that audit process, we've seen the same kinds of results. Then what that is telling us is that there is both a pattern year over year, and that the actions that have been taken have not addressed that pattern. Um, because, again, given that attendance is it has a lot of variable root causes. We want to ensure that any policy is balances being proactive and ensures that consequences are really focused on that year over year pattern. So, for instance, a thing that our working group discussed timely, uh, right after the first 3 days, I believe, of the city experiencing snowcrete, we had one of our final working group sessions. And in that session, understandably, our working group members were like, so how would this policy proposal work in situations like this where everybody across the city is dealing with the same kind of issue and it is so out of our control. Um, and through that discussion, we really focused on how recommendations, instead of, you know, um, in by acknowledging the context that was elevated during the audit, making sure that those recommendations would be focused on here are some best practices or some things to consider when an event has occurred, that event has impacted student attendance, how to get back on track with student attendance. So really trying to make it responsive, um, and limiting those serious consequences to that year over year pattern. Um, so not having that be something that would be considered for um, an event such as Snowcrete, um, that is just so out of a school's control. Um, I am mindful of time, Sanjay, so I do want to make sure that I answer a couple of the questions in the chat. But if you have any follow-up questions, please do follow up with me, and I'm happy to have a further conversation. Um, so scrolling back in the chat, again, thank you all so much for sharing these questions. The first question I see is, when would this policy go into effect? That's a great question. I am going to move the slides forward just to what you can expect for a timeline from this. So today, in April 2026, we are having our learning session and survey. Um, well, the next thing on the agenda is the August opening this policy for public comment, September having a public hearing on this policy, and October having a final vote on this policy. What you can see from there is we've got quite a bit of time between now and opening for public comment. I want to make sure that this time is used for further engagement, hearing from folks. I am planning to be at the attendance summit over the summer, as well as the charter leaders meeting. So again, being able to have these conversations, talk through questions and really refine this before putting it up for public comment. Um, when would this policy go into effect? We are anticipating that from that vote in October, that this policy would be in effect with, of course, that flag that under this policy as it is currently proposed, the only interaction that a campus would expect to have between PCSB and the campus during that school year would be if one of those conditions is met, a communication from us, making sure a school understands what to expect. If multiple of those conditions are met, going through that audit process and making recommendations, but no board-to-board meetings or notices of concern would be on the table for that school year because they do really rely on that year-over-year pattern. And please let me know if you have a follow-up question to that. The next question I see is related to will truancy rates be reviewed by PCSB under this new policy at any time? We are not expecting to use truancy as one of those indicators, but during an audit process, those may understanding the difference between a campus's chronic absenteeism rate and truancy rate may help us understand what is going on and maybe what some recommendations um, might be best suited for a school. I'm particularly thinking about instances where perhaps a campus in one given year is struggling with a lot of truancy, being able to make a recommendation and perhaps a connection between that school and a different campus that had experienced a similar issue in the previous years. So there could be some learning and expertise shared. Um, so simply put, chronic absenteeism as the metric to drive indicators, and truancy would be um, noted if it is applicable to the context that a school is experiencing at that given time. And do we have dates yet for the summer sessions? I can share. I don't believe the ability to register for the attendance summit hosted by the Deputy Mayor for Education, the Charter Alliance, the Nationals, OSSE has been shared yet. I believe that date to be July 23rd, which I believe is a Thursday. Um, as
Hey,
for,
hey
oh, go
Blair,
ahead.
I'm sorry.
Mhm.
If I could just chime in right there.
Yeah.
The date, you are correct. It is July 23rd. That is a Thursday. The event will be from 8 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. I literally just finished the save the dates 2 days ago, so they will be going out to any attendance coordinators, anyone in those attendance roles, for registration. The registration link will be ready in May, which is basically tomorrow, but more to come.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you to you and your team for all of the planning that has already been done with that. I'm excited, of course, and I hope to see many folks there. As well as I will be sure to share if there are other events similar to this one or other points of engagement. And I do want to ensure that you have my contact information so that if you aren't able to attend an event, but you would like to have a conversation with me, that we can get that on the calendar. And then I'm just scrolling through the chat to identify if there are any other questions with our last 5 minutes.
Hey Blair, this is
Mhm.
actually Courtney, not Sanjay. I do have a question if you have a
Mhm.
minute.
Yeah.
My question is more around the data and
Mhm.
actually like timing of when those are pulled.
Mhm.
So is this something you'll be pulling monthly to review and decide who's getting audits or who's getting those notices and concerns? Or not notices and concerns, but either pre-audit or you're going to fall into a desk audit.
Mhm.
My second question is, and I did put this in a survey,
Mhm.
it is an looking at what you shared, it's an overall average from the charter of anybody who falls into the framework. Like, so saying our high school, anybody who falls into the high school framework for charter schools. We serve vastly different populations, and currently Aspire addresses that by giving different floors and targets for economically disadvantaged
Mhm.
and different races. But that doesn't look like something that's going to be assumed or addressed in pulling a full just average of the entire charter sector, which feels inequitable. So is there a way that, or we can have a conversation about that? Because I think that's mostly my concern is that a school that serves mostly east of the river may have a different demographic, and a lot of our students may fall into different challenges than they do west of that. And so like, what does that look like? We could fall into the audit multiple times, multiple years, just based on the population we serve. Um, yeah.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for your question, Courtney. So for Sorry, I'm thinking about your question in two parts, and the part of my brain working on the second part of your question is going a little bit faster. So if you don't mind, I'll answer that first, and then um, I will answer the first part of your question second. Um, Thank you so much for asking about disparities and especially how Aspire approaches differentiating those student groups. I am going to flip back in slides, and I'm trying not to do it so quickly because I know sometimes I get a bit motion sick. So my apologies as I move back here. Okay, to this slide. Um, for initiating that audit process, again, I really, as we were ideating this, we wanted to think about what combination of metrics could serve as warning lights of just an indication that something different might be happening. Um, so these indications would just let us know that it may be the circumstance where PCSB would need to engage with a school just to understand like what is going on. Are there recommendations that can be made? I do want to ensure that that audit process does take into account student groups, location, the context that a school is specifically experiencing. I know that, for instance, um, one thing that really stood out to me in the research is like ninth grade is such a specific year for attendance, and there is a spike in chronic absenteeism for ninth graders that's occurring in all kinds of schools, both rural and urban environments, states with vastly different populations, and that so disaggregating by student group may help us make recommendations that more directly recognize the context that a campus is experiencing and hopefully provide some ideas or some actionable suggestions for a campus to consider. Again, considering that there are many root causes, those root causes are going to look different by different student groups, and how a campus is able to respond is going to be specific to the way that that campus approaches, school climate in general. So though those are not reflected in like what has been put forth as the warning lights or where we're starting that conversation, I do want to ensure that that's included in the procedure of understanding, what more of what is going on and really focusing those recommendations or that staff to staff meeting specifically on their particular student groups, even particular students who this may apply to. The other piece that I would like to elevate is um, because starting this conversation was, and the timing of this conversation was such a pain point under the last policy. As a staff, we've had a lot of conversations about what could it look like to engage schools early and ensure that schools are able to take action based on their attendance data and knowing that different schools have different levels of data management as well as, different folks who are on their attendance teams and multiple responsibilities. Is there a way that we could create a report sharing a campus's attendance data with them in a, just here is what we're seeing kind of way, and ensure that that can be actionable? Um, my thought process for including or not including that in the policy um, is that I wanted to ensure that that report could be ideated, could be updated, could be more responsive to campus's needs. So I hesitate to write that piece into the policy, but that is certainly a practice that we are envisioning goes with this policy to ensure that, um, if looking at um, student groups related to I, you know, in-seat attendance, truancy, chronic absenteeism, as well as just total number of days may be helpful for a campus's attendance team, making sure that those reports are sent out before any other kind of interaction with PCSB. Um, I believe that this answered the second half of your question, but I want to make sure that it answered the first part of your question.
Yeah, I just wanted to know like when that data was pulled, but if
Mhm.
I guess
Oh,
the
yeah.
timeline has is fluid right now about like what that looks like and when audits will happen.
Right.
Just worried that we could have like if we flag for one period of time, we have an
Mm.
audit, is a possibility that we have another audit that same school year. And then that puts us in a multiple audits year. So just kind of want to have some conversation about what that looks like. But me and Sandra are on the same page. I know he has other questions that he hopped off. So I did put in the questionnaire that we would like to speak to somebody so I can hold all of my talking for another time.
Wonderful, Courtney. Briefly, for the question of how often we would be looking at this data, I imagine that we would be checking this probably monthly, but I would love to hear feedback on if monthly, biweekly, would be more amenable from your perspective. Um, I I also think that this addresses the rest of the questions in the chat, and I do know that we are at time. The last thing I want to share with folks is just my contact information. Thank you so much for spending this last hour with me. I truly appreciate your thought partnership, your engagement with this. And again, if you are interested in having a follow-up conversation, please do reach out to me. My contact information is on the slide. You can also find it on DCPCSB's website. Um, I am happy to set up a time to chat. So please reach out via email. And with that, have a great rest of your day. And thank you for your time.